You might want to take one last look before you decide what kind of woman I am, Naomi Carter said quietly, her voice steady even as the first dudar against her apartment door echoed through the narrow hallway like a thunderclap that didn't belong in a place this small, this ordinary, this forgotten by the rest of the city. The frame rattled, screws whining under pressure, and for a split second the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The dim kitchen light flickering, the old refrigerator humming low, the faint scent of antiseptic still clinging to Naomi's scrub jacket draped over the back of a chair. Then came the second hit, heavier, coordinated, followed by the sharp burst of splintering wood as the door gave way, and a wave of dark uniforms and bright flashlights flooded the space. Boots thudding against the worn linoleum in tight formation, voices overlapping in controlled urgency that filled every corner of the apartment without ever rising to chaos. Naomi didn't run. She didn't even step back. Barefoot on the cool floor, she stood in the center of her living room, shoulders relaxed, hands visible at her sides, her eyes adjusting to the sudden wash of white beams cutting through the shadows like blades of cold daylight. Outside, somewhere beyond the cracked window, a siren wailed and faded, swallowed by distance. But inside the apartment, everything sharpened. The rustle of fabric, the click of radios, the faint scrape of a picture frame shifting on the wall behind her. Chief Daniel Hayes entered last, slower than the others, his presence defined not by movement but by stillness, his gaze sweeping the room in one deliberate pass, absorbing details with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he already understood the story before it finished unfolding. He had been told what to expect, a suspect, a risk, a leak buried where no one would think to look. And yet what stood before him was a woman no older than her mid-30s, posture calm, expression unreadable, the kind of stillness that didn't come from fear, but from something deeper, something anchored. Naomi's voice came again, softer this time, but somehow clearer through the noise, threading its way between commands and footsteps without needing to rise. "You're early," she said, glancing briefly toward the shattered remains of her door, then back to the line of officers now spreading through her home, opening cabinets, scanning corners, moving with purpose but not yet understanding what they were stepping into. One officer paused near the far wall where a series of framed documents hung in careful alignment, their glass surfaces catching and reflecting the stray beams of light, turning them into small, silent flashes that flickered with each shift of movement in the room. Naomi noticed it. She noticed everything. The way the youngest officer hesitated for half a second too long. The way Hayes' jaw tightened just slightly as he took in the layout. The way the air itself seemed to press in closer, heavier, as if the apartment were shrinking around the weight of assumption carried in on those boots. She inhaled slowly, steady, grounding herself not in the moment, but in something beyond it, something that had led to this exact point. "Before you move anything," she said, her tone unchanged, not pleading, not defiant, simply certain, "you should look at the wall." For a fraction of a second, no one responded. The command structure held, eyes shifting subtly toward Hayes, waiting for direction, for confirmation that this was still proceeding exactly as planned. And in that silence, thin, stretched, almost invisible, Naomi didn't blink. She just stood there, centered in the middle of the storm, as if she already knew how it would end. The silence stretched just long enough to feel deliberate, like a held breath that no one wanted to release first. And in that narrow pause, Naomi Carter became the only still point in a room full of motion, her presence quietly resisting the momentum of 30 officers who had already decided what this place was before they ever stepped inside. One of them moved past her toward the kitchen, opening drawers with quick, efficient motions. Another swept a flashlight beam across the ceiling corners, as if expecting something to reveal itself under pressure, while a third paused near the couch where a folded blanket and a paperback novel sat. Undisturbed, the scene so ordinary it almost felt staged. Naomi watched without turning her head, her eyes following reflections instead of people, tracking the way light bounced off glass frames mounted neatly along the far wall, each one aligned with precise care, each one catching fragments of movement and returning them in fractured glints. Chief Daniel Hayes remained near the doorway, not fully inside, not fully out, his posture straight, his expression controlled, but his attention narrowing, recalibrating, as if something in the room refused to match the narrative he had been given. He stepped forward slowly, his shoes making a measured sound against the floor, quieter than the others, more deliberate. And for a moment, the overlapping voices began to thin, not because anyone had been told to stop, but because his presence carried its own gravity. Naomi spoke again, not louder, but clearer, her words placed with care, each one landing exactly where it needed to be. "You came in fast," she said, her gaze still forward, not fixed on any single officer, but somehow aware of all of them at once. "But nothing in here is running from you." A younger officer near the wall hesitated, his flashlight lingering on one of the frames longer than necessary, the beam trembling slightly as it traced the outline of a document behind glass. The ink crisp, the seal faint, but unmistakable even from a distance. He shifted his weight, uncertain, glancing toward Hayes as if seeking confirmation, but the chief had already taken another step closer, his eyes now locked on the same wall Naomi had mentioned, drawn not by instruction but by instinct. The apartment felt smaller now, not physically, but in the way attention compressed space, pulling every detail into sharper focus, amplifying the quiet sounds that had been there all along, the soft tick of a wall clock, the distant hum of traffic 5 stories below, the faint rustle of paper as one officer flipped through a stack of unopened mail on the counter. Naomi finally turned her head, just slightly, enough for her profile to catch the light, revealing the calm in her expression not as indifference, but as certainty, the kind that did not need to argue to be understood. "You are looking for something specific," she continued, her tone even, grounded. "But you were not told where to look." No one responded, yet the movement in the room slowed, subtle but undeniable, as if her words had introduced a variable no one had prepared for. Hayes stopped a few feet from the wall, his gaze moving across the frames one by one, not reading yet, just observing, cataloging, the way he had done 1,000 times before in rooms that rarely surprised him. But this one did. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, accumulating details, the precision of placement, the absence of clutter, the quiet order that suggested intention rather than accident. Naomi's voice softened, almost reflective now, but still carrying that same quiet authority that refused to bend under assumption. "Most people see what they expect," she said, her eyes briefly meeting his for the first time, steady and unguarded, "and they miss what is actually there." The air shifted again, not with noise, but with awareness, and for the first time since the door had given way, the room did not feel like it belonged to the people who had entered it. It felt like it had been waiting. Chief Daniel Hayes did not reach for the frame right away, and that hesitation, small as it was, shifted something in the room more effectively than any command could have, because it meant he was no longer moving on certainty, but on doubt, and doubt had a way of slowing everything down. His eyes moved across the wall again, this time reading instead of scanning, absorbing details that had been invisible just seconds ago, while behind him the rest of the officers began to notice the change in his posture, the subtle stillness that replaced his earlier momentum. Naomi Carter remained where she stood, her hands relaxed, her breathing steady, watching not the objects on the wall, but the reactions forming in real time, the moment when assumption began to crack under the weight of reality. One officer near the kitchen cleared his throat softly, uncertain, lowering his flashlight as if the beam itself had become too intrusive, while another stepped back from it. Open cabinet, leaving it half ajar, forgotten in the shift of focus. The apartment no longer felt like a place under inspection. It felt like a space revealing itself on its own terms, one detail at a time. Hayes took a step closer, close enough now that the reflections in the glass no longer distorted the text behind it. And the first frame came into clear view, a federal seal pressed into the paper with precision, the kind of document that did not belong in ordinary spaces and yet had been placed here without display or exaggeration, simply present. His jaw tightened, not in anger but in recognition, and he moved to the next frame, then the next, each one adding context, each one quietly rewriting the situation in front of him. Naomi's voice came again, softer now, almost reflective, but carrying the same grounded certainty that had not wavered since the door gave way. "Information changes things," she said, her tone measured, not directed at anyone in particular, but heard by everyone. But only if you are willing to see it. The words settled into the room without resistance, and for the first time no one moved to interrupt them. Hayes reached out slightly, stopping just short of touching the glass, as if crossing that final inch would confirm something he was not yet ready to say out loud. The officer who had hesitated earlier shifted his stance again, this time stepping fully back, creating space without being told, his attention now fixed entirely on the wall, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet, growing awareness that something fundamental had been misunderstood. Naomi turned her head a little more, her gaze now fully aligned with Hayes, not challenging, not defensive, simply present, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. "You were given a direction," she continued, her voice calm, steady, but not the full picture. Hayes exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but in the silence it carried weight, marking the point where control began to shift from one side of the room to the other. The documents on the wall did not change, the light did not shift, and yet everything felt different, as if the air itself had been recalibrated. He straightened slightly, not with authority but with realization, his eyes moving back to the first frame again, then forward, connecting details, reconstructing a narrative that no longer aligned with the one he had walked in with. Behind him, the officers stood still, waiting, not for orders this time, but for understanding, their earlier movement replaced by a collective pause that filled the apartment more completely than any noise had before. Naomi remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet but undeniable, and in that stillness she held the center of the room without effort, not through force, but through truth that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted completely, like a line had been crossed without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened, and Chief Daniel Hayes finally lowered his hand, not touching the frame, not needing to, because what he saw was already clear enough to settle into his understanding with quiet finality. His eyes traced the seal again, then the signature beneath it, then the identification number printed with precise alignment, and for a brief second his reflection stared back at him through the glass, superimposed over credentials that did not belong to the narrative he had accepted earlier that morning. Behind him, the faint sound of a radio crackled, and then went silent as someone instinctively turned the volume down, as if noise itself had become inappropriate in a space that now demanded attention rather than action. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been, but the distance between her and the rest of the room no longer felt like vulnerability. It felt like control, not imposed, not forced, but established through presence and clarity that had never wavered. One of the officers near the doorway shifted his stance and glanced at Hayes again, this time not for direction but for confirmation, his earlier confidence replaced by a question he did not voice, and Hayes did not answer immediately, because for the first time since entering the apartment, he needed a moment to process rather than to command. Naomi watched him, carefully, not with tension, but with a quiet patience that suggested she had seen this transition before, the exact point where authority began to reconsider itself. "You can keep looking," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle now, but carrying the same weight it had from the beginning. "It does not change what is already there." Hayes moved to the next frame again, this time slower, reading every line, every detail, allowing the information to settle without resistance, and as he did, the structure of the situation began to reorganize in his mind, piece by piece, until the conclusion became unavoidable. The anonymous tip, the urgency, the scale of the response, none of it aligned with what stood in front of him now, and that misalignment did not feel accidental. It felt deliberate. He straightened slightly, his posture no longer rigid with assumption but adjusted with awareness, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, controlled but no longer carrying the same certainty. "Step back from the wall," he said quietly, not as a command filled with force, but as a recalibration, and the officers nearest to him responded immediately, creating space without hesitation, their movements careful now, measured, as if the room itself required a different kind of respect. Naomi exhaled softly, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, and she took a small step forward, closing a fraction of the distance that had separated her from the rest of the room since the beginning. The broken door behind the officers let in a faint draft, cool air brushing across the floor, carrying with it the distant sound of the city continuing on without interruption, a reminder that the world outside had not paused for what was unfolding inside these walls. Hayes turned slightly, glancing back at his team, then forward again, his gaze settling on Naomi with a new level of attention, one that no longer categorized her as a subject, but recognized her as something else entirely, something that shifted the balance of the situation in ways he could not ignore. "Why were we sent here?" he asked, the question direct, but lacking the edge it would have carried minutes earlier, because. Now it was not about enforcement, it was about understanding. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, composed, grounded in a certainty that had been present from the very first moment. "That," she replied, her voice quiet but unmistakably firm, "is the question you should have asked before you broke the door." The words settled into the room with a weight that did not need emphasis, and no one moved to challenge them. Because the answer was no longer something that could be forced into place, it had to be recognized. And in that recognition, the control of the moment no longer belonged to the people who had entered the apartment. It belonged to the truth that had been waiting on the wall all along. No one answered her question, and that silence felt heavier than anything that had happened before, not because it was loud, but because it exposed something none of them had prepared for, the possibility that the entire operation had been built on a foundation that did not hold. Chief Daniel Hayes stood still for a moment longer, his eyes no longer scanning, no longer searching, but settling into a realization that came without announcement, quiet and unavoidable. Behind him, one of the officers shifted and slowly removed his gloves, the faint snap of latex echoing softly in the room, an ordinary sound that now carried a different meaning, as if the purpose that brought them here had quietly dissolved without anyone formally ending it. Another officer reached for his radio, hesitated, then lowered it again, unsure of what message could even be sent that would explain what they were all beginning to understand. Naomi Carter took another small step forward, not closing the space completely, but enough to make it clear that she was no longer positioned as someone being confronted, but as someone standing within her own ground, unchanged from the beginning, while everything around her adjusted. Her eyes moved across the room once, taking in the open drawers, the displaced objects, the quiet disorder that had been introduced without care, and then returned to Hayes, not accusing, not demanding, simply present. "You came here with numbers," she said, her voice calm, steady. 30 people, coordinated, precise, confident. She paused for a fraction of a second, not for effect, but because the truth itself required space. "But you did not come with clarity." The words did not rise, they did not press, they simply existed, and in that existence they carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Hayes exhaled again, this time more noticeably, his shoulders shifting just slightly as if something inside him had been recalibrated, and when he turned his head toward his team, it was not to reinforce authority, but to acknowledge a change that could not be ignored. "Hold position," he said quietly, his tone controlled, but stripped of urgency, and the officers responded immediately, not with force, but with stillness, each one freezing in place, their earlier momentum now replaced by a collective pause that felt almost reflective. The apartment settled around them, the hum of electricity, the faint draft from the open doorway, the distant rhythm of traffic below, all returning to the surface as the dominant sounds once more. Naomi watched the shift without satisfaction, without visible reaction, as if this moment was not a victory, but simply a correction, something that needed to happen regardless of how it looked. "Who gave the order?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but more direct, not challenging, but precise, like a question that had only one purpose, to reveal what had been hidden behind action. Hayes did not answer immediately, and that hesitation was different from the one before, not rooted in uncertainty about what he was seeing, but in recognition of what it implied. His eyes moved briefly toward the broken doorway, then back to Naomi, then to the wall again, as if the sequence itself mattered, as if understanding required revisiting each step that had led them here. "We received a call," he said finally, his voice measured, careful, each word chosen with intention, specific, detailed, urgent. Naomi nodded slightly, not in agreement, but an acknowledgement that the pattern was familiar, expected even. And you did not question it, she replied, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Her tone unchanged, her posture still grounded in that same calm presence that had not shifted since the first moment. Hayes held her gaze for a second longer than before, and in that moment something subtle passed between them, not confrontation, not agreement, but recognition, the understanding that the situation had moved beyond procedure and into something more complex. Behind him, the officers remained still, waiting, not for orders, but for resolution, their earlier certainty now replaced by a quiet awareness that they were no longer in control of the narrative. Naomi's eyes softened just slightly, not with sympathy, but with clarity, as if she was allowing him the space to arrive at the conclusion on his own. "You were sent here," she said, her voice steady, almost reflective, "not to find something, but to miss something." The words settled into the room, and this time, no one looked away. The words did not echo, yet they lingered, settling into the quiet like dust that refused to be brushed away. And for a long moment no one in the room seemed willing to disturb them, as if even the smallest movement might confirm something they were not ready to accept. Chief Daniel Hayes stood with his shoulders squared but no longer rigid, his gaze drifting not with uncertainty but with a kind of internal recalculation, the kind that happens when a situation stops being external and begins to turn inward. The faint hum of the refrigerator returned, steady and low, and somewhere beyond the open doorway a car passed by, its tires rolling over asphalt in a distant, ordinary rhythm that felt almost out of place against the weight of what was unfolding inside. Naomi Carter did not speak again immediately. She let the silence do its work, let the realization move through the room without interruption, because forcing it would have made it weaker, and she did not need force. She never had. One of the officers near the wall lowered his flashlight completely now, letting it hang loosely at his side, the beam no longer cutting through the room, but fading into the floor, as if the need to search had quietly disappeared. Another officer closed a cabinet door gently, the soft click sounding louder than expected, drawing a brief glance from someone across the room. Then nothing. The apartment was returning to itself, piece by piece, reclaiming its space not through resistance, but through truth that had been present from the beginning. Hayes finally shifted his weight and turned slightly, his eyes moving across his team, not as a commander surveying a task, but as a man recognizing that the task itself had changed. "Stand down," he said, his voice low, controlled, but unmistakable, and the words moved through the room with quiet authority, not urgent, not sharp, but final in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. The response was immediate, but different from before. No sudden movement, no rushed action, just a collective easing, a release of tension that had been carried in without question and was now being set down without resistance. Naomi watched this shift with the same calm presence she had maintained throughout, her expression unchanged, her posture still grounded, as if this outcome had always been part of the path, not something earned, but something revealed. Hayes turned back toward her, his gaze steady now, not defensive, not confrontational, but searching for clarity in a way that felt new, unfamiliar even to him. "If this was meant to misdirect," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "then someone wanted us to come here exactly like this." Naomi nodded once, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it carried agreement without needing elaboration. "Yes," she replied, her voice quiet but certain, "and they needed you to move fast enough not to ask why." The statement settled into place, connecting pieces that had not been visible before, and Hayes' eyes shifted again, not to the wall this time, but to the space around him, as if the room itself held answers beyond what could be seen. The broken doorway behind him framed the hallway in dim light, the edges rough, the air still moving gently through the opening, and for the first time it did not feel like an entry point. It felt like evidence. Hayes took a slow breath, deeper than before, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something that had not been there earlier, not doubt, not hesitation, but responsibility. "Who benefits from this?" he asked, not looking at his team, not looking at the wall, but looking directly at Naomi, because now he understood that the question itself mattered more than the answer. Naomi held his gaze, steady and clear, her eyes reflecting not judgment, but a quiet expectation that he would follow the thought to its conclusion. "That," she said softly, "depends on how long it takes you to realize you were not the one in control." The room fell silent again, but this time it was not the silence of tension or confusion. It was the silence of something unfolding, something larger than the moment itself, and for the first time since the door had opened, Chief Daniel Hayes did not look like the man who had entered the apartment. He looked like someone who had just stepped into the truth. Chief Daniel Hayes did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched longer than any before it, not because he lacked words, but because the truth he was beginning to see required him to abandon the version of control he had carried into the room, and that was not something a man in his position did lightly. His eyes shifted again, not to Naomi, not to the wall, but inward, reconstructing the chain of events that had led him here, the call that had come in, the tone of urgency, the specificity that had left no room for hesitation, and now, standing in this quiet apartment with his team no longer moving, no longer searching, he could see it differently, not as a directive, but as a setup. Behind him, one of the officers adjusted his stance, the faint creak of his utility belt cutting through the silence, and another took a slow step back toward the hallway, instinctively creating space as if the center of the room no longer belonged to them. Naomi Carter remained still, her presence unchanged, but now it carried a different weight, not just calm, but confirmation, as if everything that was unfolding had already been understood long before they arrived. Hayes turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across his team, and for the first time since the operation began, he saw them not as extensions of command, but as witnesses, each one standing in a moment that was shifting beyond procedure into consequence. "Clear the perimeter," he said quietly, his voice steady, but no longer carrying the sharp edge of enforcement, and the officers nearest the door responded immediately, moving with controlled precision, not rushing, not questioning, but adjusting, stepping back into the hallway, their movements careful, deliberate, as if aware that every action now mattered in a different way. The apartment grew quieter with each step they took, the space opening up again, the air settling, the faint draft from the broken doorway continuing to move across the floor in a slow, steady current that seemed to mark the passage of something unseen. Hayes waited until the last of them had shifted out of the immediate space before turning fully back to Naomi, the distance between them now unobstructed, clear, and in that clarity there was no longer any confusion about who held the understanding in the room. "You knew this would happen," he said, not accusing, not defensive, but stating what had become obvious, his voice lower now, grounded in recognition rather than authority. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, her eyes reflecting not triumph, but a quiet acknowledgement of timing. "Not exactly like this," she replied, her tone measured, calm. "But I knew someone would try to move fast enough to avoid being questioned." Hayes nodded slowly, the motion almost imperceptible, as if each piece of the situation was settling into place with a weight he could feel, but not yet fully articulate. He glanced briefly toward the wall again, toward the credentials that had shifted everything, then back to Naomi, and something in his posture changed again, not dramatically, but enough to signal that he was no longer operating under assumption. "Internal affairs does not display identification like that unless there is a reason," he said, his voice thoughtful now, analytical, as if speaking the logic out loud helped confirm it. Naomi's lips curved just slightly, not into a smile, but into something closer to recognition. "Correct," she said softly, "and they do not leave it visible unless they expect someone to see it." The implication settled immediately, and Hayes' eyes narrowed just a fraction, not in suspicion of her, but in realization of the larger frame surrounding them. The call, the urgency, the scale of the response, it had not been about her. It had been about him. The apartment, the wall, the timing, all of it aligned too precisely to be coincidence. And for the first time the question was no longer who Naomi Carter was, but why he had been brought here to stand in front of her. Hayes took a slow breath, the air moving deeper this time, steadying him as the understanding took full shape. "This was a test," he said quietly, the words forming not as a guess, but as a conclusion, and Naomi did not interrupt, did not correct, she simply held his gaze, allowing him to arrive at it fully on his own. The silence that followed was different now, not uncertain, not heavy, but clear, like a line drawn with precision. And in that clarity, the entire operation shifted meaning. Hayes looked around the apartment one last time, the open drawers, the displaced objects, the broken doorway, and then back at Naomi, and for the first time since he stepped inside, his expression held something that could not be hidden behind authority. Awareness. Then I already gave them their answer, he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying the weight of realization that could not be undone, and Naomi's response was quiet, almost gentle, but it landed with unmistakable finality. Yes, she said, you did. The words did not need repetition, and they did not need reaction, because they had already settled into the space between them with a weight that could not be undone, and Chief Daniel Hayes felt it in the way his posture no longer held the same structure it had when he first stepped through the door, the kind of structure built on certainty, on command, on the assumption that control was something you carried with you instead of something that could be taken from you without warning. He glanced once more toward the wall, not to confirm what he had seen, but to acknowledge it, the frames now standing not as objects, but as evidence of something far larger than the room itself, something that had been watching, waiting, measuring. Naomi Carter did not move closer, but she did not need to. The distance between them had already collapsed in a way that physical steps could not replicate, and the quiet in the apartment held steady, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but defined by clarity that had replaced everything else. Hayes exhaled slowly, the breath deeper than before, as if he was releasing something he had carried for years without noticing, and when he spoke again, his voice no longer carried authority as its foundation, but responsibility. This was not about you, he said, not as a question, but as a realization spoken out loud, and Naomi gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not affirming him, but allowing the truth to remain where it was. No, she replied quietly, it never was. The simplicity of the answer did not soften its impact. It sharpened it. Hayes looked toward the doorway, where a few officers remained just beyond the threshold, their presence subdued now, their movements minimal, waiting without instruction because the situation no longer belonged to procedure. He could feel their awareness, their uncertainty, but he did not turn to address them yet, because this moment had not reached its end. He looked back at Naomi, his gaze steady, no longer guarded, and for the first time there was something unfiltered in his expression, something that could not be shaped by rank or training. Then what happens now? He asked, not as a demand, not as an attempt to regain control, but as a question that acknowledged he no longer defined the direction. Naomi held his gaze, her eyes clear, grounded, reflecting not power, but perspective, and she took a slow breath before answering, not because she needed time, but because the answer itself required precision. Now, she said softly, you decide what kind of officer you are when no one is telling you what to do. The words did not rise, they did not press, but they landed with unmistakable weight, and Hayes felt them settle into place, not as pressure, but as a mirror. He glanced down briefly, just for a second, his eyes catching the faint reflection of the room on the polished floor, the broken line of the doorway behind him, the stillness around him. And when he looked back up, something in his expression had shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to be seen. He turned toward the doorway, his voice calm, measured, carrying clearly without force. Secure the exterior and dismiss the unit, he said, and the officers responded immediately, not with urgency, but with quiet efficiency, their movements controlled, respectful, as they began to step away, one by one, their presence receding from the apartment until only the soft echo of their departure remained. The space grew larger again, the air lighter, the quiet deeper, and Hayes stood for a moment longer before turning back to Naomi, the room now holding only the two of them and the truth that had unfolded between them. He straightened slightly, not to reassert authority, but to stand with intention, and his voice, when it came, was steady, clear, and stripped of everything unnecessary. This should not have happened, he said, not as an excuse, not as a defense, but as an acknowledgement, and Naomi listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her presence still grounded in the same calm certainty that had defined her from the beginning. No, she replied softly, but now it did. The statement did not accuse. It did not absolve. It simply existed, and in that existence it left no space for avoidance. Hayes nodded once, a small, controlled motion, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, complete, holding the weight of what had been done and what would come next, and for the first time since he entered the apartment, Chief Daniel Hayes did not look like a man trying to control a situation. He looked like a man ready to face it. The apartment felt different now, not because anything had been physically restored, but because the weight that had once pressed against every surface had lifted, leaving behind a quiet that was no longer tense but complete, like a room that had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Naomi Carter stood near the center of that quiet, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if the storm that had entered her home had passed without ever truly touching her, leaving only traces behind in the form of open drawers, displaced objects, and the broken line of the doorway that still let in a slow, steady stream of cool morning air. Chief Daniel Hayes remained where he was for a moment longer, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood that leaving required more than movement. It required acknowledgement, and that was something he had not always allowed himself the space to do. His eyes moved once more across the room, not searching now, not analyzing, but observing, taking in the details he had overlooked before, the quiet order, the intentional placement, the calm that had existed long before he arrived and would continue long after he left. Naomi did not interrupt his thoughts. She did not guide them. She simply stood there, present, allowing the moment to settle into something that did not need words to be understood. Outside, the faint sound of footsteps faded down the hallway as the last of the officers cleared the building, their presence dissolving into the rhythm of the city beyond, leaving behind only the soft hum of everyday life returning to its place. Hayes finally took a step back, then another, his movements measured, deliberate, not rushed, as if each step carried its own meaning, its own recognition of what had occurred within these walls. When he reached the edge of the doorway, he paused, his hand resting lightly against the frame that had been forced open, the wood rough beneath his fingers, a physical reminder of a decision made too quickly, too completely, without the question that should have come first. He did not look away from it. He let the texture remain, let the awareness settle deeper, because this time he did not turn from it. He faced it. Slowly, he turned back toward Naomi, his gaze steady, no longer guarded, no longer shaped by rank or expectation, but grounded in something simpler, something more human. "I will make this right," he said, his voice quiet, not as a promise made to regain control, but as a statement rooted in responsibility, one that did not need to be believed immediately to hold its weight. Naomi met his gaze, her expression calm, unchanged, but there was something in her eyes now, not approval, not doubt, but recognition of the effort it took to say those words without certainty of how they would be received. She did not nod. She did not respond with reassurance. Instead, she spoke with the same quiet clarity that had guided the entire moment. "Then start by seeing it clearly," she said, her voice soft but precise. "Not just what happened, but why it happened." Hayes held her gaze for a second longer, the words settling into him with a depth that did not require repetition, and then he nodded once, a small, controlled motion, not for her, but for himself, marking a shift that could not be reversed. He stepped back into the hallway, the light there slightly brighter, the air cooler, and as he moved away, the sound of his footsteps did not carry the same weight they had when he arrived. They were quieter now, steadier, grounded in something that had not been there before. Inside the apartment, Naomi remained still for a moment longer, her eyes moving slowly across the space, taking in the details left behind, the subtle disorder, the quiet aftermath, and then she turned toward the wall, toward the frames that had never moved, never changed, standing exactly as they had from the beginning, silent and certain. The light from the open doorway reached them now, catching the edges of the glass, reflecting softly across the room, and in that reflection there was no tension, no urgency, only stillness. Naomi took a slow breath, the air steady, familiar, and for the first time since the